Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and my guest with me today is, well, I really should call you the Reverend because you are a teaching elder, Darren Middleton from Jalong. Darren, welcome. It's great to
Thank
have
you.
you.
Thanks for inviting me on. It's a joy.
Yeah. Now, Darren, this is Profiles in Christian Living. So the first thing I want to ask you about is your own journey to faith, and then we'll get into, really the guts of what I want to talk to today about church revitalization and planting. But tell us your own testimony, first of all.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, come from a long line of unbelievers. After my conversion, I started to wonder, when was the last time Middletons worshipped the Lord? Found a Bible with a King James Bible with an inscription from Ellison Street Presbyterian Church back in the 1890s. And so that was the last relative we had. So it gives some context that our family has never believed, never worshipped, not even occasional. I'll be honest with you, up until I was 23, I had not met a Christian. Now, I'm sure I had met Christians, but no one who had actually articulated that they were Christians and why they were Christians. And so I never actually, and I grew up in Frankston area, which was pretty much working class. And, you only had two options back in those days. You ran fast or you fought. And so never met a Christian. So 23 years old, just started a management career with Coles Myer. And I met this girl who actually we'd hired as a casual. She was going into nursing, but she had, I think, 6 or 9 months to kill. And so we'd hired her as a casual, and I overheard her speaking about Christianity as I was walking past. And I pride myself on being a naturalist Darwinian. So, this is the first Christian in 23 years. Looking forward to engaging with her. And anyway, so we did that, and these engagement went on, and they were very aggressive. I was very aggressive, and I just couldn't actually believe that people still believed in God, let alone the Christian God. Not that I knew a whole lot about it, but I just knew that it was just obviously you're an intellectual pygmy if you believe these things. And so anyway, we went back and forth for weeks, and then one day she came in and she slapped a big NIV study Bible on my desk in my office and said, "The next time you want to mock me for the faith, at least try reading it." And you know what? Actually, even though I mocked her at the time and sort of told her to go, it resonated with me because I realized my only engagement with the Christian faith had been through second sources. I had never read the Bible in my life. I'd only read books about people who had read the Bible and had discredited it. And so I thought I should read it. Never did, of course. Put it somewhere in my house. Probably 3 months later, maybe a bit longer. It was a Sunday morning. I used to work 7 days a week, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. 6 days a week, sorry. Sunday was any day off. Got up early, 6 o'clock in the morning. Thought to myself, where is that Bible? I should start reading it. Anyway, couldn't find it, but I did find it eventually. Pulled it out. Looked for a quick précis. No quick précis, apart from the NIV notes at the back. So I just thought, I'll start at the beginning. So you can imagine, as a Darwinian, starting the bit honestly, it was ridiculous. That's what I thought. Absolutely ridiculous. I had this notepad next to me, and I'm taking notes, and all in my mind is, cannot wait for tomorrow. Cannot wait for tomorrow. I'm going to absolutely smash this girl. And so I'm writing all these things with malicious intent. I'm reading, hours and hours. I'm knee deep in Philistine blood, working through Old Testament narrative, and I'm thinking, where is this Jesus guy? Mind you, I'm actually thinking, this is great, because I'd actually had this picture of this soft, almost effeminate Christian God, and Jesus sort of, kumbaya, everyone holding hands. And I'm seeing blokes with swords and chopping people to pieces. And I'm thinking, oh, right, so this Christian God is really gracious and loving, isn't he? And so somewhere in this process, I had this desire to find out something about Jesus. I'm just flicking through the Bible, And finally, it must have landed on one of the Gospels. Started reading and just read and read and read. Then my mum come in the afternoon. And so this is like 6 or 7 hours later. And I'm lying on the floor, notepad, stop taking notes, just reading. She comes in, she goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, Mum, just, can you go away? Come back later. What are you reading?" "The Bible." "What?" Runs out to the car, comes back in, camera, click. "Dad's going to love this. It's hilarious." And off she goes. And so anyway, ridicule aside, kept reading. About 5 o'clock that evening, I'm convicted. I'm just this overwhelming conviction that this Christian God, it's true. This Jesus is somehow God, somehow something about he has died for my sin. That's about as sophisticated as it was, but it was a deep conviction that was incredibly emotional. So I remember actually weeping over my sin. But the strength was like, what do I do with it? Am I a Christian? I can't be a Christian, surely. And so I just had all these questions with no answers. And so I rang up my secretary and said, "Oh, can you get the phone number of this girl?" So she does. So I ring her up and I say, "Hi, it's Ruth, it's Darren." She's like, "Who?" "Darren, hello." "Darren Middleton, Mr. Middleton from work." "Oh, Mr. Middleton." No, later on thinking, wow, I must have made a real impact on her. But anyway, and we used to call each other by our last name, Miss Joyo, Mr. Middleton. And so anyway, I explain it, what's happened throughout the day. She says, "I think you're born again." And I go, "What does that mean?" She goes, "Oh, I think you're a Christian. I think you actually now believe." And so anyway, from there on in, it was a long, you talked about, you had an interview or having an interview with Rosaria Butterfield. I remember she talks about her life being a train wreck after conversion. That's what mine was like. Everyone talks about, conversion and joy and happiness. No, destruction, car crash, think of it like that. My
Why?
whole life was tipped upside down. Friends who didn't know what we were doing, and I didn't know what I'm supposed to do with my friends. Did I have the boldness to admit I'm a Christian? It was 12 months of just uncertainty. And it didn't help that my company moved me interstate at the time. And so I was dislocated, eventually found a church and a good pastor who was evangelical. And he really helped me through that process. So long story, but that's how I became a Christian.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I've never heard it. I've known you for 20 years, but it's amazing, mate. Yeah, all glory to God. Just how He breaks in. By the way, that Ruth that gave you the Bible, that's not the same Ruth that you married later on.
That is, I said to her, "This is your reward for evangelism." We just had 31 years of marriage. I'm still not sure that she's quite convinced of the reward, but nonetheless, that is the reward. But that's the irony, is that the very first Christian I met in 23 years, she's the one the Lord sent to witness to me, and then by the power of the Spirit be converted. And that had then ripple effects all through my relationships and family. My dad thought I was an idiot and was not happy. In fact, didn't even believe I was converted. He said, "Oh, you just did it for the girl," sort of thing. And so it created huge tensions with my family, because I used to be was very close to my family. But in God's grace, years later, I had an opportunity when I was interstate. I had to come back for a conference or something, and my mum had an interest and said, "Oh, I'm seeing changes. You want to stay with me?" Because I was staying in a hotel. "Want to stay with me and then explain to me why you're a Christian?" And it was literally like that. She invites me to evangelize her. And so I did. I think I did something like Christianity Explored with her over 4 nights. Well, my dad used to work night shifts, so it was okay. And she gets converted. And it was just extraordinary. Well, for me it was. And yep.
And what about your dad? What happened with him?
My dad, remained steadfast in his unbelief and a little bit of frustration at me throwing away a career when I eventually went into ministry. And yet my mum died 18 months ago, dementia, really, really awful period of time. And it shook all of us. But my dad's a very old school bloke, pig-headed, very proud. He's alive. I hope he doesn't hear this, but he probably will. But he's one of the proudest men. I actually grew up in my life thinking, I don't think I've ever heard him say sorry for anything. So he has resisted God all of his life. Not long after Mum died, he was devastated by my mum's death. Devastated. So he was suffering depression, a whole lot of issues, and crying all the time. And so I was ministering to him, but it was hard because we're like two bulls in one paddock, so it makes it a bit difficult. And one day he said to me, I just want to die and go and be with Mum. I said, Dad, if you die, you'll never see Mum again. You go to hell. Mum's in heaven. And my wife was with me at the time, Ruth, and she was a bit shocked by she later rebuked me saying I was far too harsh given the context. And I was reflecting on it thinking, maybe I was, but I know my dad he's like a rhinoceros. It's hard to pierce the exterior. Anyway, about 2 weeks later, he rolls up on a Saturday and he says to me, I'm going to come to church tomorrow. So this is my dad, 87 years old, has been to church in the last 30 years, while I've been a Christian, maybe twice, once for my ordination, maybe once for a Christmas once where he was dragged in, but he just never. And he says, come to church. Anyway, he comes along and everyone in my church knows about him because of my mum. And my mum had come to our church, and that was the reason we came back to Victoria to look after Mum and Dad and Ruth's mum and dad. And anyway, so everyone's been praying for him. Everyone knows we've been praying for his salvation for over 3 decades. He becomes a Christian.
Wow.
I'm serious. It was just like, and in my congregation, which, go figure, by the grace of God. And anyway, I did a pastoral visit to him and I said to him, Dad, you've been coming to church for like 3 months. Where do you really stand? And really pressing him on. And he says, I believe I'm a Christian. I'm going, talk me through it, Dad. What does that actually mean? And he says, can you remember that? He says, I came to you and I told you how I was depressed. And I just wanted to die and be with Mum. He says, and you said to me, Dad, you're not going to be with Mum. You're going to hell because God will judge you for your sin. And he says, it shook me. It just shook me in a way that I've never been shaken. He says, and I couldn't sleep for days and days. And the whole time I kept thinking about, when I die, am I really going to face God? And if I am, and he's going to judge me for my sins, then I'm in serious trouble. And he said, I didn't know what the answer was, but I knew one of the things I need to do is probably go to church. Comes to church.
Wow.
Some of my elders have been working with him and talking through the gospel, and obviously so have I. And so as best as I can know, it's always hard in these situations to know, but it looks like it's a genuine work of God. He's been coming to church every Lord's Day for the last 5 months.
And is there plans to baptise him or anything like that?
Yeah, we're in summer. A lady just got baptised last week, who's just been converted this year, and that created a discussion with him. And so he's actually been baptised as in the Catholic Church. His parents, one of 13 kids back in the day. So I wouldn't probably re-baptise, but there does need to come a point where you can't be a private Christian.
No, there has to be at least a profession of faith, doesn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's where we're at, talking about, my dad, finished school 12 years old, basically, and then basically worked in the mines from 14 all of his life. So he's probably not the most, cerebral, articulate fellow. So taking him through this process of just trying to understand where he's really at and making sure it's not a I just want to be with mum thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's just
But anyway, tricky. It's a tricky, but look, it's a beautiful place to be. My kids, it's been such an encouragement for everyone in our church and kids. Everybody knows where my dad's been at for so long. But for my kids' self, we've been praying every day that the Lord would draw my dad to himself. He'd place Christians in his path or others that would witness to him. And, for 3 decades, get into your late 80s and you start thinking,
yeah.
what an encouragement.
You mentioned before that your mum took a photo of you that day with your dad's camera. Have you still got the picture?
Yes, I do, actually. It's up on my wall. Status, my dad was converted. The Lord was gracious to me.
You'll have to send it through to me and I'll put it in the show notes for people to see. That'd be remarkable. I've got to ask you too. There's a real challenge I find today, and I actually want to interview others about this, but I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot. The challenge about caring for elderly parents, particularly as Christians. What have you found? I mean, you've seen some great joys and opportunities in that, but what do you think are some of the challenges with that and responsibilities that we have, particularly as Christians?
Yeah, great question. It is something that's exercised my mind in a way that I had never really prepared for previously. It's not something you really generally discuss. But when I was in Sydney, where I used to pastor, my wife's father, who was a Presbyterian minister, it looked like at one point he was going to die. And so Ruth said to me, look, I really need to go back to Victoria for a while, spend time with family. I said, yep, you do that. So she did that. Dad pulls through. But then she comes back. She said, look, I really feel like we should look to return and look after our parents. So that was the first time that came on our radar. Then she felt very strongly about that. I loved my elders where I was at, so I was very reluctant to leave. But pretty much everywhere I went in the house, there's text about, up on the wall, those who don't look after their own family are worse than unbelievers. Even like in the toilet, she was preaching it to me everywhere I went. And so finally I said to her, look, I think you're right. Think at this point, our responsibility now, it was that tension, isn't it? That sense of call to this congregation and our obligations there, and our sense of, the fifth commandment to honour our parents. What does that look like now at this stage of our life? We also talk about concentric circles of duties, and then you've got duties and responsibilities, and the further the concentric circles go out, you've got just opportunities. We felt this was still in the concentric circle of duty in the fifth commandment. Our parents, none of our siblings were either in a position or willing to look after our parents. So then we got to the point where we said, okay, we made the decision to go back, and then the Lord's providence had a call that was a great opportunity of a renewal work, a revitalisation in Victoria. So we took that and we came back. And the day we were unpacking, Ruth's dad had a stroke. Oh, wow. And so we hadn't unpacked. We literally, the truck was still there, and we just jumped in our cars, drove to Melbourne. And pretty much he didn't really recover from that stroke, went in from there into nursing care, etc. So we just then said to Ruth's mum, let's get into Geelong. We'll sell your house. We'll move you to Geelong. You don't have to do anything. We'll do everything. So we did that. The Lord was so gracious. We sold her house in 2 weeks, packed it up, moved into Geelong. And then in the next year, we convinced my parents to move to Geelong. And so then we sort of made them the promise that we wouldn't move or take a call outside of this area, and we would see them till the Lord called them home. And so Ruth's dad's died. My mum died. Ruth's mum's like 94. I'm not saying that God's forgotten she's here, but it looks like she's going for a while, so she could go on to 100, I reckon. But she's got dementia, and so that brings with it a lot of stresses when you're dealing with people with dementia, and my mum had it. and then we got my dad. So in our own mind, the Lord in His wisdom has allowed us to marry providentially that sense of duty to our parents to come and care for them, with a great opportunity to do revitalisation work in Victoria. And so it dovetailed well, and we saw that as part of God's kindness and providence to us. And we've loved our time back in Victoria because of that.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jesus' words at the end of John's Gospel when he says to John, "If it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" Maybe it's just that the Lord wants you at Geelong for a long time, brother.
And that is what my wife has said to me every time someone's sort of given us a little call saying hello. My wife said, "Remember that promise we made to our parents?" Not a conversation. So, but it's borne much fruit, so we've been very happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's right. There's a lot of wisdom in that, and it's really important to honour those types of vows and promises. Tell us, what has the ministry at Geelong been like from the time you've got there to where it's at now?
Well, we 2010, I think we arrived June. I always remember that well because it was Collingwood Premiership year. For you in Sydney, that doesn't mean a lot, but for me as a Collingwood supporter, it meant a whole lot. So great way to join the congregation, small congregation, been in decline for some time. There'd been a very faithful minister before me, very faithful, a reformed guy, but his job in a sense was almost bringing things to closures, and so they'd close the congregation. Got down to, I don't know, about 20 something people, but one reformed elder and a ex Tasmanian Presbyterian minister who was in the congregation, who was functioning as an elder, Danny Combridge, and so those men were a real attraction to me because I have a view of call and ministry as I go to a place where, based on my relationship to the eldership, if we can get a common vision for what ministry looks like, then I don't care the size of the congregation. So I wanted to do a revitalisation work because I just find they're easier, smaller churches to change than a bigger one that has institutional and structural issues that make it very hard to change. And so we've been here 13 years, and graciously God has grown it. And we've moved from the building which we were in to a sort of an industrial warehouse building, which is much larger capacity. It's got 110 painted car parks, so it's got good. Where our other place had 2 car parks, so we were parking out streets. And so the church grew over those years. But as we moved, we also did a repot. So we took 40 odd people out of North Geelong and repotted a church in our presbytery, which has God has graciously blessed, and it's now full charge. And so we're looking at planting another church January 24.
I mean, it's amazing, Darren. Just as amazing as seeing the conversion of your parents is seeing the growth of his church more collectively. Although a lot of Reformed churches are not really known for being missional. Why is that? And what do you think is the solution?
Why is that? I think one of the reasons is we came out of union, and we were very concerned with our theological position because of what had happened at union in the 70s. And so most of the older men, that second generation past that, and there's now a third generation past that. But those first generation, those men fought for just truth, for the Bible. They were facing issues to do with Freemasonry and liberalism and a lot of those issues. And so that was the battle. The battle was for scripture. The battle was for orthodoxy. The battle was trying to sort out the theological college. And it sort of can become a mindset, that your mindset is reactionary. And so you're always conscious about orthodoxy. And so the Westminster Confession of Faith, obviously, which I love and have signed up for, but that it can seep into your mind that you think that my job is to defend the orthodoxy as described in the Confession of how we know the Scriptures. And that does not tend then to be on a footing of being missional. It tends to be on a back foot of being defensive. And so I think, and I understand that. And so the second generation are trying to move from that and embrace being missional. But we've inherited, the majority of our congregations are in very poor health. And we inherited a generation of leaders that perhaps were not biblically qualified to be leaders, at least in many cases. And so that has left our congregations in a very poor condition. So they're not missional at all. In fact, many of them aren't even evangelical, let alone be reformed. And so I think that's why we probably don't have a missional perspective. And also, I think sometimes there can be a suspicion about people who are missional that somehow they're not going to be reformed and evangelical. Or they're just evangelical and missional, but they're not reformed. And so I think there can be those sort of, sometimes that can be real, but I think it's an unhealthy way of approaching it. Rather, we should be embracing and saying, look, we're living in a post-Christian world. So what does it look like to engage our community and our culture? And we have to be on the front foot. We have to be equipping our people to bear witness to Christ in that context. And I think in that sense, where Keller's argument is that the only really fruitful congregations are those who can contextualize the gospel well and are very missional in their thinking. I think to some degree that is true. It's not always true, but I think it's largely is true. And I'm not convinced that that's a strength in our Reformed tradition. It used to be, historically, it's always been. I mean, all the great mission movements have been in a Reformed tradition, historically. So I think that's something where we need to make an adjustment without ever losing our commitment to being reformed. We need to embrace being that evangelical, gospel-focused, but missional in our approach and our disposition.
So what does that look like practically on a week-to-week basis in your church?
Well, I think in our congregations, it looks like first we've got to equip our people for that. So that's your priority. As elders, our responsibility is to equip God's people for the work of ministry, Ephesians 4, 11 and 12. But the work of ministry is theirs. And if you see the work of ministry primarily, not just in the congregation, but at a coalface, in homes and in schools and in workplaces and in sporting environments and in cultural spaces, if you see that as where the gospel fleshes out, that's where we bear witness, that's where we're lights that are shining in dark places, then our responsibility at the congregational level and at leadership level is how do we equip our people well for that? What does that look like? And I think that's something perhaps we don't do as well as embrace. And again, that's probably a view of how you do ministry. And maybe that's something that is not, we have many views of how you do ministry in the Presbyterian Church, and that's where we have our differences, I guess.
So do you think then the core problem is a philosophical one, that the minister does the ministry rather than the people of God being equipped to do the ministry? Do you think that's at the heart of the problem?
I think that is a serious aspect of it. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think the Presbyterian Church is set up for the clerical model. Like if you look at our code, the minister is the moderator of the board of management. He's the moderator of every meeting. He has the key. You know what I mean? Like we see him as key to everything. And don't get me wrong, teaching elders are a blessing to the church, but they're one of many elders. And we have ruling elders who are also a blessing to the church, and they're shepherds also and teachers. And so that clerical model rightly probably extends from a view of Christendom, which is where most of our Reformed creeds are made contextually. And so that probably could work in that context. But when you're living in a post-Christian world, then I think you've got to have a model where you see the Ephesians 4 text, and I realise you can look at that from what they call the coordinate view, where the minister equips the saints, the minister does the works of ministry, the minister through his ministry brings unity, or you can see it in the subordinate view, which is the view I think that most of the modern translations take, is that the teaching elders and ruling elders are gifts of God to the church to equip the saints, and the work of ministry is actually what they do. And I think that's how you flesh out the one another verses of Scripture in deep community, where we love one another, pray one another, equip one another, teach one another, rebuke one another, correct, etc. All those one another verses where you do Christian community and you form disciples, or that's your spiritual formation. That happens amongst the congregation. And so if that's where I think culturally in the church, the big issue that's facing us is that view of leadership. Because if you don't, depending on your view of leadership, that affects whether you have an attractional church model, which is built on a Sunday, around a minister, around a service, and people can punch their worship cards, so to say, and go about their week and come back, or a discipleship type model, which is based on that subordinate view of Ephesians 4, where you see the work of the ministry, gospel ministry is actually the congregations. And we're equipping them as elders for that work, but the work is actually theirs. And so then much of what you see as the church life is not so much Sunday based. Of course it is. The high point is always the Lord's Day and worship, but you're meeting together during the week, you're equipping during the week. And it's that discipleship model where you have deep communities that I think is the most effective in a post-Christian world. And my experience, certainly at North, is that, coming out of COVID, etc., is, we've probably seen the most growth this year in all the 13 years I've been here, and almost all of that has come out of, non-Christians, coming out of our community and building relationships, and people hungering for something deeper, hungering for purpose, men hungering for purpose, women hungering for community. And they're finding that initially just in things like groups that we're offering and connections that we're offering, and then through that, the gospel. And so I think that type of missional approach where the church has been sent out, but it's equipped to be sent out. So there's no point castigating congregations about evangelism if you don't ever equip them for the very work of bearing witness. And so I think, and I'm very much shaped by, you can't do Matthew 28, make disciples who make disciples, if you don't do Ephesians 4. And so Ephesians 4 is a precursor to Matthew 28. So any church that doesn't do Ephesians 4 and the leaders don't equip the saints for the work of ministry can't really do Matthew 28. And you really can't then castigate your congregation for not doing it either. And so when I look at Victoria, which I know pretty well, and a little bit of knowledge of New South Wales, the big weakness outside of some strong inner city churches and things, but once you get out past regional and country, is a lack of leadership. The thing that we're seeing continually, I'm on a committee that looks at this, is the key to revitalising congregations is leadership. And you can't bypass that. And if you don't, I think you had an interview with Alan Harmon, and in that you asked for an observation on, you were talking about church history and what lessons you can learn. One of the observations, I think, I'm paraphrasing him, but I think he made the observation is, in my own words, but no denomination will rise above its theological college, right? Yeah. Well, no congregation will rise above its elders. Elders are a glass ceiling. So if you've got ungodly elders, if you've got elders that are not evangelical, reformed, or missional, then guess what? You won't have a congregation as the same, because they're the ones who set the culture.
Can I ask you a controversial question then? And I don't know what your answer is going to be. So this is not pre-scripted. Do you think term eldership is something that could bring about more quickly renewal in our churches, to see good elders appointed, tired elders given a break, bad elders replaced. Do you agree or disagree?
Disagree. Pragmatically, I'm attracted to it. I just can't see biblically how you can get there, and I don't see how you can get there without then saying term teaching elders. Because if you have a view of eldership where you got ruling, teaching elders as one office, you can't have aspects of the office being a term without in my view, you can't. There's no consistency in that, and I also think the answer isn't pragmatics. Do you know what? We've got a lot of elders that are not qualified to be elders. That's the harsh reality. They would not, if you were doing it again, they would not qualify biblically for that role. But this is where lament comes in. This is where we lament the sins of the past, and those sins visited upon from the fathers to the sons. Well, this is the lament of that, and the way about that is proper reform. The Lord brings revival, but we must do reform, and we must do the heavy lifting and the hard work of reform, and that means presbyteries acting like Presbyterians and going through their congregations and actually saying, do we have biblically qualified elders here? If we don't, what are we going to do about it? What does that look like? And doing that in a systematic way. And I know my own presbytery, we've done that over bit more than 10 years. With the Lord we've done the reform. The Lord has great fruit from it. But I think what happens is we just don't do reform. So what we do is we become pragmatic and we try to create systems where we can bypass that. And we create a leadership structure that can bypass the elders. And I can see the attraction pragmatically. I'm just not convinced that ultimately it's fruitful. So
I'm intrigued when you say your presbytery has done visitations and it's asked the hard questions. What has that meant on the ground? Are you challenging certain men? Should they remain elders?
Yep, that's exactly what you do. You surely, if the word of God, which is what our confession says, is our standard, if that's our rule, then of course we've got to keep going back to the pastoral epistles and holding them up like a mirror. I don't mean bullying people, but I do mean that we should be confronting people. That's what Scripture does. It rebukes, it corrects, it trains, right? So we should be confronting people saying, are you qualified to be an elder? Should you consider stepping down? And I think the path of blessing for someone who's not qualified is to either step down or to be retrained, and whether that qualifications is a lack of training, as in for teaching, but if it's a character deficit, then the only option really is to step down. And now I realise some will say you're being unrealistic and idealistic. Maybe. I'll tell you a story, but let's keep that between us.
Sure, yeah.
My first parish, when I went through theological college, which again was last century, admittedly, but anyway, went through theological college. Everyone told me when you go, don't go changing anything, don't cause trouble, just love people. So I went out, my first parish, to be honest, virtually very few people were converted. Very few were converted. So I thought I was going out to be a shepherd to sheep, and essentially I was a shepherd and there was goats. So I tried loving those people the best as I could, preached the gospel, visited regularly, which was easy to do. It's a congregation of 10 people, 3 congregations, 10 in one, 8 in the other, and about 18 in the other. 2 of the elders, one was a woman, one was a Freemason that never attended church ever, except on communion. So what do you do? Do you know what I mean? Like, what do you do? What is the blessing in that? And so for a year, I did nothing. When I said did nothing, I didn't try and change. I was trying to love, trying to instruct, nothing. And then I just realised there's no blessing in this. I know what scriptures say. And so I purposed in my heart that I would address the issue. Because actually I was rebuked. The first guy got converted in that congregation, who was my mechanic. And by the way, I paid for that conversion because I could fix my own cars. I was just taken to a mechanic literally so I could meet people and evangelise, and the Lord used it. He's my first convert, right? Well, the Lord's convert, but first guy I witnessed to, he gets converted, he comes, elder comes on a Lord's Supper, And then he was just like, I won't say the guy's name because he may still be alive. Is he a Christian? Has he come to church? Can't be an elder, surely. And I was that embarrassed and that convicted that here is this new convert rebuking me. And so, Mark, I said to my wife, I'm going to go to his house, open up the scriptures with him and show him from scripture. And I said to her, I'm not leaving without your resignation. You are not qualified to be an elder. I got there at 7:30. At 11:30, I'm starting to think, maybe I am leaving without a resignation. And he was very angry, and I won't tell you all the details, but very frustrated. I realised I'd been praying and reading. He kept leaving the room, coming back in. His wife would come in and abuse me. 11:30, I called him back in. I said, okay, listen, obviously you're not going to think, but I'm going to ask the presbytery to call an emergency meeting. And at that presbytery, one of us will be resigning. And my guess is it will probably have to be you. So here is your option. And, eventually he resigned that night, about 11:45 at night. Everyone else would tell me it was bullying now. But anyway, different century. And I said, can you write it down? He wrote it down. And that was the turning point in that congregation's life. And from that period onwards, we saw just phenomenal. It was my first congregation, so I don't even know what revival looked like. But I look back now, I think that was like in a country town, it was like revival. We'd have like 90 to 100 young men and women coming to an afternoon theology class, and we'd do Old Testament, New Testament, apologetics, all stay for an evening worship, and then they'd be in the manse till 11:30 night on a Sunday night talking theology. Young blokes went to theological college from there, and elders and things like that. And all of it I can trace back to that moment with that elder. So I think there is value in that.
Okay, part of the challenge is making the hard calls, but a large part of the challenge, the opposite side, more positively, is about growing keen young men into those positions. What does that look like in your ministry today?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think I'm convinced that the key to reform, and then the Lord's grace, refreshment, and perhaps even revival, is the leadership. And so, like at North, we've been very intentional about that. We have an 18. It was 2 years. It's now 18 months. But a 2-year initially for the first 10 years was a 2-year training program. And so the session would select certain men that we thought were potential, and we just simply say to them, look, we're asking you to commit to this for the next 2 years. Doesn't mean you will be an elder. You just need to have a willingness to consider. And we would look at Timothy and talk about where it says the man who desires to be an elder desires a good thing. And that desire, I think, is a sense of call, a conviction that the Lord is calling me to shepherd a flock. We realised that you may not have it, but we just need you to be open to it and agree to consider it over that 2-year period. And so that 2-year period, we taken through what we think are classic books in all the areas, something from spiritual formation, prayer, soteriology, covenant theology, taken through the confession, taken through a preaching class, get them to read books on engagement, culture, mission, gospel. And so we cover all the areas of what we think is good formation for leaders. And at the end of that 2-year period, the session then evaluates where we think they're at. And then all the elders that have been ordained at North have come out of those groups. And we've done 4 or 5 of those. So that's, obviously in 8 years worth of training. And we've ordained, I think, just off the top of my head, I think about 6 or 7 elders out of that group.
Yeah, fantastic. Wow, what a wide-ranging interview, from the conversion of your parents to coming to Jalong to challenges with eldership. Darren, maybe one final question, what do you think are the major challenges that are going to be facing the church in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think internally, like if we looked at it from a denominational perspective, we're close to crisis. That's my take on it. Others are much more positive than I am. So I'm just saying this is my personal view. I think we're in a crisis. In Victoria, we have 130 congregations, 104 something pastoral charges. Out of those, maybe 20, 25 could support ministry from the offerings alone. Now, they can support from other means, but just from the offerings of God's people, 25% of our congregations maybe. In Victoria, we probably have 12 congregations with 100 people or more. But the average size of our congregations are probably around about 37, 40. And that's bumped up by the higher ones, so a lot. So we're in a crisis. There's only one way to say that. Most of our country parishes, particularly, they are in crisis. As in, you got ministers with 3 or 4 congregations, and they're just doing maintenance, running around doing maintenance around huge areas. But we are still denominationally quite blessed with finances, which is a blessing and a curse, because I think it causes us to prop things up longer. I think there's a guy called Mark Sayers, has some interesting thoughts, but he always says every crisis, every renewal, that it was actually preceded by a crisis. Now, it doesn't mean that every crisis will lead to renewal, but if you see every point of crisis, the possibility that if we look to God, that the Lord could do a work of grace and renew. And that's where I think we're in Victoria. I don't think New South Wales is hugely different. Might be, but from my memory, not hugely different. And so we really need a work grace. Almost all of the works that we will be doing, our blokes coming out of college will be going to, will be revitalisation. And therefore, they're difficult works because you've got existing infrastructure and you need good, not just good preaching, but good leadership, wise leadership, to be able to bring the transformation and change under God as you develop leaders. So I think that's the internal one. And my encouragement of that is that we're seeing our committees in our church realising that. And I work on an MDC committee, and we've been funneling and working about, like, let's only put money into trying to revitalise. So I think that's the internal. External, we're living in a world, in a culture that I know it's considered to be anti-Christian. I think it is at some levels, maybe elite levels and things like that. My experience, certainly at inner city it might be, but certainly in the suburbs and elsewhere, it's not anti-Christian, it's just ambivalent. Just ambivalent. If you have no purpose, then you always find your purpose in pleasure. Anyone without purpose will end up resting in pleasure. And so we live in a very affluent society, so everyone can rest in pleasure for the moment. And so our task is to offer another view of flourishing, where we can present the gospel, and our people who are equipped to present the gospel can go into their community and offer another way of what does it look like to flourish in community? What does it look like to be a man and a woman and a child and a husband and a wife? And I think I actually hold great hope for that. I actually believe that sort of, not the program way of evangelism, but that sort of organic way of witnessing through friendships and works and seeking the common good is very, very effective. And so we need to be able to have leadership that I think can direct our common. If we're going to see renewal through our crisis, that's the way forward. One other thing to leave you with, one of the stats that I picked up in Victoria when we look at a lot of the stats is that you can almost correlate a church that is unhealthy with a history where there's almost no new elders in the last 15 or 20 years. That is, there's no intentional discipleship and of leadership. And that's obviously the cause, and then the symptom is you've got an unhealthy church. But what it tells you is if you want to reverse that, people going out have got to have a very intentional discipleship program of creating leadership.
Yeah, no, it's very important. And I think to a trend that I've seen in that regard is, and again, I don't know what you're going to say in response to this, but alongside the eldership is pastoral care teams, made up of men and women.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that? Is that a replacement eldership, or does that complement, do you think, what
I think sometimes it can be a way of getting around clunky Presbyterian infrastructure that isn't working well, perhaps, if that's the cause. But I think in a positive case scenario, it could be, the more people that are working, and you can, I think the scripture gives us two offices. At North, we have deacons as well as elders. The deacons do such a brilliant job. Wish we honestly that we should have had them much, much earlier than we have. But anyway, they're flourishing. They do a great ministry. And what they do is they connect these groups who are doing pastoral work. And I actually believe, so in our groups, we have, in midweek groups, we've got about 20-something groups around town that meet each week. And the pastoral care is done by those groups. And then the elders all then lead bigger groups that meet, which are more like your traditional Bible studies, which are more sort of cerebral and renewing the mind. We call the other one refreshing the soul. It's renewing the mind. And our elders all lead those. And the elders then are responsible for the pastoral care of everyone in those groups. And so I think we've got to teach our people that pastoral care is what all of God's people do. So the way you might structure that in a congregation, I do think there is flexibility. I don't think it has to be in some way trying to bypass offices, but actually can complement.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I mean, I've seen it in my congregation in Hobart. The importance of having deacons and elders working together,
Yeah.
and in two different spheres of ministry is just vital for the health of the church.
Yeah.
Well, Darren, thanks so much. It's been amazing to hear about what God's done in your life, is doing in your life, and I'm sure is yet to do. Every blessing to you and your ministry, not just at Jalong, but in the wider church. It's been great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Really appreciate it. Great chatting with you.
Yeah. Well, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and found it edifying, and I look forward to seeing you next time.